a work of fiction. For 30 years, Pastor Marcus Whitfield had one gift that no seminary could teach and no scandal could seem to take away. He knew how to make a room full of strangers feel like they were the only person in it. 10,000 people could be sitting under the lights of the Crown of Grace Cathedral on a Sunday morning, and every one of them would swear, walking out, that Pastor Marcus had been talking directly to them. That was the gift. That was the empire. And for a long time, it seemed like nothing could touch it. Crown of Grace had not always been a cathedral. It began in 1988 as a rented storefront in a strip mall outside Charlotte, North Carolina, with folding chairs and a borrowed sound system and 40 people who showed up because Marcus's father, a tent revival preacher named Elias Whitfield, had convinced them that his son had the anointing. Marcus was 24 then, restless, more interested in television production than theology, and he had spent his 20s running cameras for his father's broadcasts rather than standing behind a pulpit. He used to joke, later, that he became a preacher by accident. The way some men become fathers, you don't plan it, and then one day it's just your whole life. The accident came when Elias suffered a stroke in the spring of 1994 and asked his son, from a hospital bed, to fill in for one Sunday. Marcus said no 3 times before he said yes. He preached that first sermon in his father's borrowed shoes, quite literally, because his own dress shoes had a hole in the sole and he didn't want anyone in the front row to notice. Elias died 8 days later. Marcus told the story so many times in the years that followed that it became a kind of scripture of its own. The boy who never wanted the pulpit, called to it in the space of a single week, forced by grief into the only job he'd spent his whole life trying to avoid. What followed was 2 decades of almost uninterrupted ascent. Marcus dropped the fire and brimstone cadence his father had used and replaced it with something gentler, something that sounded less like judgment and more like a coach talking a losing team into believing they could still win the game. He talked about favor, about breakthrough, about the idea that God wanted people to be prosperous, healthy, and happy, not just eventually in some heaven no one could see, but now, in this life. Starting Monday morning, crowds that used to number in the hundreds began numbering in the thousands. By 2003, Crown of Grace had outgrown 3 buildings, and Marcus made the decision that would define the rest of his career. He leased the old Ironside Arena, a 15,000-seat former hockey stadium the city had been trying to unload for years, and turned it into the largest sanctuary in the state. The books came next. Your Comeback Starts Today sold 2 million copies in its first year and sat on bestseller lists for months. Then came Bigger Than Your Past, then The Favor Advantage, then half a dozen more, each one a variation on the same reassuring theme. Your best days are ahead of you, and God is not angry with you. He is rooting for you. Marcus stopped taking a salary from the church in 2006, a decision he mentioned in nearly every interview for the next 15 years, and lived instead on royalties, speaking fees, and television syndication revenue that made him, by most public estimates, worth somewhere north of $60 million. He and his wife, Renata, bought a mansion in a gated community outside the city, and reporters loved to note the contrast between the modest brick storefront where Crown of Grace began and the marble foyer where it now, in some sense, lived. Criticism followed him the entire time, the way it follows anyone who says something reassuring to millions of people and gets rich doing it. Theologians accused him of preaching what one particularly cutting columnist called a Sunday morning pep talk with a cross bolted onto it. A rival pastor once told a national news program that Marcus's gospel was God is nice, you're nice, be nice, and that summary followed Marcus around for the rest of his life. Quoted in nearly every profile written about him afterward, he was pressed, more than once, on television, about whether people of other faiths could go to heaven, and his answers were vague enough that they satisfied almost no one, not the people who wanted a hard line, and not the people who wanted an open door. He apologized publicly at least twice for those vague answers over the years, each time promising he had only meant to express humility, not doctrine, and each time the apology satisfied his critics a little less than the last one had. But nothing tested the empire the way the flood did. In September of 2019, Hurricane Odell tore into the Carolina coast and stalled for 2 days, directly over Charlotte, dropping nearly 40 inches of rain in 72 hours. Neighborhoods flooded that had never flooded before. And Crown of Grace, the enormous, gleaming, 15,000-seat arena that Marcus had spent 2 decades building into a symbol of abundance, posted on its social media accounts that the building was inaccessible due to flooding and directed displaced families to other shelters across the city. Within hours, people were driving past the cathedral with their phones out, filming a parking lot that looked, from the angle of a car window, mostly dry. The video spread faster than any explanation could keep up with. A local radio host asked, on air, why a church that could hold 15,000 people wasn't holding a single one of the families sleeping in their cars 3 miles away. The hashtag that trended by that evening was blunt and unkind. Hashtag tax the cathedral. Marcus released a statement insisting the lower parking structure had, in fact, taken on water, and that the building had never fully closed its doors, only delayed opening them for safety inspections. Photographs later surfaced showing flooding in the garage levels, exactly as he'd said. It didn't matter. By the time Crown of Grace opened its doors to shelter evacuees 2 days later, and did genuinely, house nearly 400 people, with hot meals and cots and volunteers working through the night, the story had already been written, and it wasn't a story about generosity. It was a story about a rich man who hesitated. Marcus went on morning television to defend himself and made it worse. Asked why the church hadn't opened sooner, he said that if they'd taken in a large number of evacuees and the building actually had flooded around them, that wouldn't have been a good story either. A sentence that sounded, to exhausted and displaced viewers, less like caution and more like a man protecting his brand instead of his neighbors. A furniture store owner across town, who had opened his showrooms to evacuees within the hour, became the local hero of the storm. Marcus became the punchline. He tried, the following Sunday, to reframe the moment from the pulpit, telling his congregation that God had never given Charlotte more than the city could handle, and that they should stop being upset over something they were equipped to survive. Even members of his own congregation later admitted, quietly, that the line had landed wrong. It sounded like a man who had never once gone a single night without power telling people who had lost everything not to be so dramatic about it. The flood receded, eventually, the way floods do, but it left something behind that didn't recede with it. A permanent crack in the foundation of trust that had taken 30 years to build. Every controversy after that one seemed to slide easily into the crack that Odell had left. When a financial watchdog group gave Crown of Grace an F for transparency 2 years later, citing the fact that less than 2% of its $90 million annual budget went to charitable works outside the church itself, the story barely needed context. People already believed the worst, and the numbers simply confirmed it. When it came out a year after that the church had quietly accepted $4.5 million in pandemic relief funds meant for small struggling businesses, and only agreed to repay it after the local paper ran the story on its front page, nobody was shocked. They had stopped being shocked by Marcus Whitfield sometime around the 3rd day of the flood. It was against that backdrop. Years of accumulated suspicion, a reputation running on fumes, a congregation that still filled the seats every Sunday but no longer defended him quite as fiercely in the group chats and the comment sections, that the final chapter of Marcus Whitfield's public life began, not with a scandal at all, but with a locked filing cabinet, an internal church audit, ordered by a new board chairman who had grown uneasy about the murky line between Marcus's personal foundation and Crown of Grace's general fund, found a pattern of transfers stretching back nearly a decade. Speaking fees paid to Marcus by outside ministries that were, in several cases, routed first through church accounts before being redirected to a private trust bearing Renata's maiden name. Individually, each transfer was small enough to escape notice. Collected together, across 9 years, they totaled just under $3 million. The board chairman, a soft-spoken orthodontist who had sat on Crown of Grace's finance committee for over a decade without ever once raising his voice in a meeting, brought the findings not to the press, but to Marcus directly, in a private meeting that lasted 4 hours and that neither man ever fully described afterward. What happened in the weeks that followed was not a trial, not an arrest, not the kind of tabloid ending that the internet, by then, half expected and almost seemed to want. Marcus was never charged with a crime. The church's lawyers determined, after their own review, that the transfers, while a serious breach of the trust placed in him by the congregation fell into a gray area of nonprofit compensation law rather than outright theft. But the board voted, in a closed session on a rainy Tuesday in November, to accept his resignation as senior pastor, effective immediately, with a statement that thanked him for 3 decades of ministry, in language so carefully lawyered that it revealed, in its very carefulness, exactly how far the relationship between Marcus and his own church had fallen. He gave his last sermon on a Sunday morning 2 weeks later, to a sanctuary that was, for the first time in nearly 20 years, not full. He did not mention the audit. He did not mention the board, or the trust, or his father, or Odell, or any of the 30 years of headlines that had led to this particular morning. He talked instead, one more time, about comebacks, about the idea that God specializes in taking broken things and making something out of them that nobody expected. Some in the congregation later said it was the best sermon he'd ever given, precisely because, for once, it didn't sound like a pep talk. It sounded like a man talking to himself. He walked off the stage that day without an altar call, without a book to promote, without cameras following him to a green room, and by the following spring, Crown of Grace had quietly dropped his name from its website altogether, replacing his biography page with a new interim pastor's, as though 30 years could be edited out with the same ease as a broken link. Marcus Whitfield did not vanish. He gave a handful of interviews, wrote no more books, and eventually moved with Renata to a smaller house outside the city. The kind of house, reporters couldn't help noting, that most of his own congregation could have afforded. He still shows up, occasionally, at other churches' Sunday services, sitting somewhere in the middle rows, no longer recognized by everyone, sometimes recognized by no one at all. Those who do recognize him say he sings the hymns quietly and leaves before the closing prayer is finished, the way a man leaves a room he built with his own hands, once it has finally, fully, stopped being his.